Welcome to the final segment of the Leadership Development Plan series by Dynamic Leadership. If you've been with me for the first 3 episodes, you know the urgency and importance of the first 90 days of a person starting a new position or after getting promoted. In this final episode, I want to focus on practicality. The heart of the matter is leaders need development plans. Without them, organizations run the risk of inconsistency, misalignment, and wasted time. Too many incorrect assumptions can be made when it comes to adding a new leader to your team. Why were they promoted? What is their style? How do they handle conflict? What's their threshold for pressure? How prone are they to falling into a stress response? How quickly can they get back to a growth mindset after facing a major setback? And then finally, what's their standard for integrity when under pressure? And a host of other factors. There's dozens of leadership styles out there, and they can all work. Some leaders favor the family metaphor. Others lean on command and control. Others take on a servant leadership style or use a political metaphor for leading. It's not necessarily that one is right or wrong, but you want to have consistency across your leadership team. And I would also argue that there are some industries or projects or initiatives, operations that favor servant leadership. For example, the sales department is probably going to work better in a servant leadership model than it's going to in a command and control. But if you're in a call center, for example, we probably want a little bit more command and control. And so it's not so much one is right, one is wrong, but you want to be intentional about the leadership style that you're using in your organization, and then what your expectations are of leaders who are coming in terms of the leadership style and methodology that they use. Now, still others invent their own leadership style based on their comfort zone, which is another problem because these are not repeatable and they're not necessarily based on best practices. But when you allow each leader to default to their favorite metaphor, you end up with a patchwork of approaches that may or may not align with your guiding principles. And it can take months before it becomes clear that a new leader's instincts are in conflict with the culture and direction of the organization. It doesn't mean the hire was wrong, but it does point to why the first 90 days of development is so important. Now contrast that with fields like medicine. A doctor or nurse, they can step into a new hospital or clinic anywhere in the country and perform effectively from day one. Why? Because there's a defined set of universal skills, practices, and expectations, common language. No one's relying on their preferred metaphor. They're drawing from a common framework. Yet, even in these disciplines, they also have continuing education requirements. The point is, there's always going to be a need for development, but you can also have standardized practices, certainly not across leadership around the whole country. That's not realistic, but in your organization, for sure. Now, you should want the same for your business. Development plans are how we establish this framework. They create consistency in how leaders think, act, and grow. They also ensure that when a leader steps into a new role, they're not bringing in personal biases that may run counter to your values and vision. And here's the additional wrinkle. Businesses don't have the natural testing ground that, for example, sports teams do. Sports teams face opponents every week or every few days who are doing everything they can to stop every single play. That kind of relentless feedback exposes weaknesses fast. We don't have that in business. Business organizations, they don't always face that external pressure, and we don't have the immediate feedback. On the one hand, this makes success easier to achieve. And on the other hand, it makes it far easier for gaps and deficiencies to hide beneath the surface until major damage is done. I've mentioned in the past talks about the importance of both project and operational skills as a starting point for leadership development. I mean, that to me is the basic fundamental one because organizations need both. Just because a leader had a title in a prior organization, there's no guarantee that they're capable in project and operations. While leaders may be stronger in one or the other, there should be an expectation that they have a base level capability and a common language that works across your organization. In fact, when you think about it, every existing company was once a project and survived through a series of projects spread across periods of operations. Some of these projects were likely proactive, while others may have been in response to a crisis. But either way, projects are the vehicles of change Project leadership is a skill that, like operational leadership, is a skill, and both can be improved upon. Companies that get good at both operations and projects will likely outperform. They tend to anticipate needed changes earlier than if they wait for the marketplace to penalize them. And as a result of being proactive, they have more options. And by continuing to add capabilities, they also increase their resilience. Contrast that to companies that default to solving every problem by writing a check, buying their way through closing gaps, so to speak. They'll never be as resourceful or resilient as companies that innovated their way forward. When it comes to project work, getting leaders engaged early, even before the design phase begins, it matters because outcomes of projects eventually feed right into operations. This is a step often overlooked, and companies try to correct it with change management on the back end. Going back to earlier talks, that 95% of actions and behavior are habitual. The earlier you begin layering in these new actions, the better. So by getting the leadership team involved, and I'll demonstrate it a little bit later in this session, by getting them involved early on, that's starting the change management process because they're thinking about it, they're working through it, they're subconsciously making adjustments in their own departments and silos, etc. I want to leave you with a thought about hiring experienced leaders because these may be the ones most often overlooked when it comes to development. And it's even potentially that you're looking at this person as, wow, they are really skilled, but we're looking at it at one slice, right? And that's based on the interviewing process. We don't know really what their gaps are until you go through this, which is why I advocate the development plans. We're assuming that they don't need it, and they're unlikely to raise their hands because they may not even be aware of their gaps. Leaders are promoted for a variety of reasons. Some excel because they followed instructions to the letter. Others, they rise because they control their teams tightly. Still others were in the right place at the right time and delivered a quick, visible win. Now, none of these are inherently bad, obviously, but each comes with risks, and without a plan, without some kind of a structure, you won't know how wide the gap is between what they're doing or what their experience has been and what you're expecting in terms of your vision and your guiding principles. Waiting for the dust to settle, say the first 6 months, it's too late. You've already blown past that first critical 90-day mark when they're most susceptible to learning something new and making adjustments to their methodologies. And once you begin the development plan, if done right, you keep that 90-day window going over and over and over because we're constantly giving them something new, and you're keeping the body and the nervous system primed for adjusting and learning new things. I talked about this in episode 2 using the term allostasis. I encourage you to take a look there. I also have a carousel on the Dynamic Leadership Company page that talks about it. You have about 90 days when the nervous system is most primed for adjusting to the new environment, and that's the point. An easy way to start is with the company vision and guiding principles. You don't need really any preparation to do that. You already know your company vision, and if you don't know it, you have it in your mind. I mean, that is the vision, whether you think about it that way or not, because that's what you're living out of. And the guiding principles. Now, you may need to document these, but you know what your guiding principles are if you just spend a little bit of time thinking about it. My point is you can start this process right away. Ideally, that alignment work should begin before the employment offer is finalized. That's with new people coming in. But you can start tomorrow with your existing leadership team by simply working through what your guiding principles are real time. As the owner, you get the final say, but hearing from each person and getting their input increases buy-in. And if they have to shift one way or the other, you can begin that process even in that conversation and then further while integrating development for your current leaders. Now, to illustrate the power of a proactive approach, I'm going to walk through a project template that's suitable for any size project. I encourage you to think about using this in your own organization. Not to be confused with a project plan or project management tool. This is a project leadership tool. You don't hear a lot about project leadership. We've operationalized in many industries project management. You may have heard of Agile. But we've done a lot to operationalize the project management. But without project leadership, without strong project leadership, your projects are still destined to have problems and often come up short. So this template I'm going to go through in a few minutes is a project leadership tool. Projects should have a project leader, and it's usually somebody on the senior leadership team, if not the owner or CEO themselves, but usually somebody who reports to them. They become the sponsor of that project. It's coming out of their budget, for example. They're the final voice. The project manager is responsible for running the day-to-day project and delivering within budget, on time, and with the right scope, and of course, high quality. The project leader is the one who's going to sign off on scope and budget changes if those do arise, and ensuring that the quality goalposts don't move. That's a very easy thing to happen as projects get closer and closer to the deadline or closer to budget. People start cutting things off, and a lot of times it's quality because it's not as easily quantifiable as some of the other factors in a project. So this position is critical, the project leader. Otherwise, you can find projects morphing into something that's more incremental and less transformational than intended. This gets into why companies are constantly reinventing, and they're doing it over and over and over, and they're not really making the progress that they wanted to. And it's often because they're using an operations approach to leading their projects. So the template is best completed as part of a facilitated conversation, ideally across stakeholders, and should include your leadership team. This brings everyone on board, and as I mentioned, it starts the change management process. But by having stakeholders involved, you're getting a common language, you're getting the input in advance. And what's interesting, even on $1 million projects, I have found that this project template, it endures. Even at the end of the project, you can pull it out and you're still following along with it. Now, of course, what we expect people to do, the leaders and the managers on the project, we expect them to use this document. And if it has to change, it's got to come back to the leadership team or the stakeholder team. But by having it in documentation at the very beginning, you remember the telephone game, right? Where you're telling the next person something, they tell the next person, they tell the next person. By the time it comes around in the circle, it's completely different. You avoid that problem by having this document, and it's in writing, and you've done it before you've done any work. And that's what makes it easy for it to endure. That's what makes it easy for people to stick with it and follow it. And as I said, it gets the buy-in because you've had the different stakeholders involved in the design of it. Now, if you don't have the leadership team, or for some reason you can't bring the leadership team in, you can use a proxy, have a proxy like a coach or a consultant. You can use your attorney or even an accountant. So any stakeholder who's interested in the success of your organization can be a sounding board. You can use a peer, somebody from another company. You guys can help each other out. You might be involved in a mastermind. There's different ways that you can get through this facilitation. Ideally, I would say the leadership team and stakeholders is the first choice, and then you can go from there. And in a pinch, you can ask AI for things to consider and then select from that list. I wouldn't use the answers from AI, but you can use AI to give you ideas, and that way it kind of helps you think through different elements that you may be including. You'll see it makes more sense once I get into it. Now, if you want to work through this template with me on a project that you're considering, use the link in the description on this post. You can schedule a complimentary fit call. In 45 minutes, we'll have a conversation about what you're trying to accomplish. Make sure there's adequate alignment. And if so, on a limited basis, we can take up to 2 hours on the project design. And I'll do that as complimentary because you're watching this video. And then from there, you will be able to keep the project design. We will work through it in a facilitated way, and then you will own that project design once you walk away. And then if you want to work further, we can talk about that. But that initial step would be complimentary. So what we'll do now is we'll take a look at this project template. It's a leadership tool. It's not a project management tool. And you can use this for $1 million project. You can use it for a $10,000 project. And because it's the art part of it. It's getting your ideas and thoughts down on paper and doing it in a way before the stress comes in. Once you have dollars on the line and timelines, et cetera, it's very easy to get caught up into stress responses. So the first thing, obviously, is the project name. So we're just going to put the project name. That's simple, right? Straightforward. And then you're going to have the objective. Again, it's straightforward. I don't want to get into vernacular and how you do it, but you have the vision, then you have your your goals, and then you have your objectives. I would think about it like that. And then you might have your tactics to reach those objectives. That's one way to think about it. And then this one is interesting here, doing what, for whom, and why. And I like to suggest that when you get to the for whom part, you resist thinking about the end user. You want to be thinking about the sponsor. Get your team used to thinking about the sponsor, who's paying for it. Because as you scale your organization, you as the owner or CEO are here, and you have your leadership team. The people who are using this document are going to be a few levels below potentially, and they need to be thinking about who's the sponsor. That doing it for whom is the person who's writing the check. Now, initially, you can put both. You can put, for the vision of the organization and the group that you're serving. You can do that in the beginning, but I do want to encourage you to think about the whom is the sponsor. This is important. So in the scope, we're going to put the thing to avoid scope creep, right? And then this one down here, you notice that the top one is larger than the bottom one. So on the bottom one, I might have like eight items. Like in this one, I may have 8 entries. And then in the lower one, typically I end up with about 3 entries. The reason is because we want to call out the things that are in scope. And you can use this, by the way, when there's sub-projects. You can use this at the master project level, and then you can use it at the sub-project level. But the reason I put in the 3, it's the obvious ones. You're calling out that you're going to change the CRM, but one of the things that are out of scope is coming up with a new platform. You want to stick with the same platform, but you're going to use different modules in that platform is what I wanted to get to. So there's, like if you're changing the website for the organization, you might say changing to a portal is out of scope. We're not going to move to a portal. We're going to stay here. Or changing to an enterprise solution is out of scope. We're going to stay with this current solution for now. Whatever it is, just call out the ones, and it keeps people, it frames people and gets them focused on where you're focusing on. Guiding principles are very, very important. This is where you're going to get your freedom of action, right? Because it enables you to delegate not just tasks, but you can then delegate the entire responsibility. Delegate the responsibility. The leader's accountable, but this person would be responsible for doing the day-to-day work. And now they have freedom of action because they can look at the guiding principles. And a lot of the ones that I often use under promise and over deliver. I use effectiveness first, then efficiency. I'll say things like that, and they tend to repeat, but as the leader, you'll want to have those articulated and know what they are. And they do change. You might, again, I'll try to have 6 to 8 of them. Deliverables, these are actually potentially sub-projects. And these are, yes or no, either it was delivered or not. And it helps start to frame things. It helps you organize the work. And again, if you have your leadership team involved at the very beginning, this conversation gets easier, right? Because you're talking about deliverables, and people already know who's going to be using that deliverable and who's going to own the deliverable. Then the assumptions is this is going to be the things that you're not sure about. These are going to need to be checked on, right? They need validation. You may want to do some testing. It may require some skunkworks testing, or you may want to do a short-term fix, and that might be up here as a deliverable. A short-term fix might be something that I want to do because if you're under stress, if the organization is under stress already, you're in a crisis mode, there might be something you have to do right away, short-term fix, and then that gives you the breathing room to spend more time with it. Then what here, I like to do here. So remember up here we had doing what, for whom, and why. And then here we're going to restate it. And the reason for that is now that we've thought through it, we're going to come up with the soundbite. It's not quite an elevator speech, but it's the one sentence description that everybody can rally around. You know what it's going to be. Where everybody knows what they're talking about when they say it. It's going to be descriptive enough. It's going to resonate with people. There'll be ownership around this thing, and that becomes the new name. And I'll tell you where that comes into play. This is used in the design work. Then we have what are the risks and what are you going to do to mitigate it? Because if you think about this being a facilitated conversation, risks will come up. You might do some brainstorming. You want to capture the risks, and you may not do it all in that facilitated conversation, but you get the risks down here, and then what are the possible mitigations? Same thing with resources. What are the resources we're going to use? You know, we might be able to use this software code from here. We might be able to use the tooling from over there. We might be able to use the campaign from earlier, the same customers on the campaign, the list or whatever. So it's not just the resource, it's how you're planning to use them. And then these would be your sub projects. So I would say the deliverables are the bigger buckets. And then the sub projects are the other things that have to be taken along. So you may have to do some training. You may have to, in the case of the CRM, we may need to do some research. We may need to get some different data collected to be able to do that. That becomes a sub-project in order to deliver something. Depending on the size, you know, some of those sub-projects will have full project teams with them. As the projects get bigger, you can see how this gets layered and layered and layered. And hopefully also you can see that trying to run a project from an operational standpoint or like an operations, it's a non-starter because you're not going to be thinking about these things. You're not going to be dealing with dependencies. And then here's the follow-up item. So there's always going to be something that you didn't think about. What else do you need to do? That's going to go here in the follow-up items, and you'll assign somebody to it as well so that that work gets done. So a couple of weeks ago, I talked about having this operational period, and then we have some project work to get to that next level. It adds a new capability. Then we have this operational period. Then we have some project work. It might deal with a big change that's coming, or maybe you add a new customer. You add a new target customer. And then we go along, and then you have another change where last time you added a new target customer. Now you're adding new products for existing customers, the Ansoff matrix. And you keep working through this, and it makes perfect sense because when you started the organization, I guess a part of you may have been thinking, well, yeah, we're just going to get this thing going and we're going to keep adjusting and move it along. But then if you think about it as the vision is here. It's going to take this kind of work to get to that vision. And this is going to happen over time. Now, when you start doing this, you can see context for development. That's sort of the backdrop. So if you don't have the project capabilities in your organization, you're going to be firing on just a few cylinders compared to the organization that does. You're not going to be able to respond. You're not going to be able to be proactive because the work is just too hard. You start doing little projects and get better and better at those, and you'll have people in your organization who rise to the occasion and they just show up as good project people, and you want to move them around to different projects. But generally speaking, they're going to be cross-functional. They're going to be operational, and then part of their time will be on projects. You know, we don't have the luxury of having people dedicated to projects, but you do want to identify those people who have a bias towards the improvement as opposed to the status quo. And I was talking about scope. This is an important point here that I like to use. We use the triangle. We have scope, time, and budget. Now, I often will see this triangle, and one of these will be quality, and that's because they don't really have any freedom of action with time. I can't change the time, so it's, you know, quality is there, time is locked in. I prefer to use those three there and then put quality in the middle, because quality is a given and it's a non-negotiable. And scope, time, and budget, they may not be eligible or available to change, but at the end of the day, projects have scope creep, they run over time, and they have cost overruns. So these do change. And the logic is that you don't change one without changing the other. And this is why you need a project leader. The project leader is the person who gets to decide if we're going to increase the scope. Because if you're going to increase the scope, you're going to have to either add more budget or add more time. And sometimes you can't do it with just budget because there is a fixed time to do certain things in terms of scope. But that's the project leader's call. You don't want that to be the project manager's call, because if you do, you run the risk of having quality get pushed to the back burner. And then the other thing I'll point out using this idea, we talked about this before. So you have your comfort zone, companies and people, they operate in the comfort zone. And, they're going up and down, up and down. They're reacting to things. They're in the comfort zone. And then when we have projects, we're able to break through this barrier, inertia. We break through the barrier, and then above the barrier, and this is the good to great. So if you think about the companies in Jim Collins' work that went from good to great, he compared them to companies that continued going along as it was. And then he had the companies that not only broke out, but maintained a trajectory, an upward trajectory and he had some standards, minimum standards, but they maintained it for at least 15 years. And then when he did the book Great by Choice, he went back and looked at the companies that made the leap from good to great, and he looked at the ones that continued the trajectory. So some of them fell off after the 2008 financial crisis, and he looked at the ones that continued. And that's why I like to use Good to Great and Great by Choice as two books along with Multipliers by Liz Wiseman, because these books have so much research in them that they become what I call near principles. So now that you're operating above here, and you're still going to be doing this, what we talked about, you have some operational time, and then you have a project. You have some operational time, and you have a project. You have some operational time, and you have a project. Now, this is different from here, because in the comfort zone, you're using your internal compass. You're using what you've always done. You're using existing parameters to keep you in between those two lines. When you're up here, you have all kinds of shiny stuff. You got your VUCA, you have your threats, you have your opportunities, shiny things, changes, and in Great by Choice, Jim Collins talks about simple, methodical, and consistent. And so that's where you get into here. So you're using your guiding principles to stay narrowly focused as you go up and down, up and down, up and down. So I wanted to just pull this together with pictures so that as you think about going through the project template, it's not just in a vacuum, but you're looking at it in how it enables you to be like a good to great company that breaks out and then stays on that same trajectory. This is still a project leadership conversation. We're still talking about the stakeholders and the leadership team. We've gone through the process. We've talked about everything. We're still in the leadership conversation. Maybe this is the second or third facilitated meeting on this topic. And then remember I said that here we're going to restate what we're doing. So we're going to put that here. So you restate that. And then there's a thing called Merlin method. You can look it up, MERLIN. And it was where I think it's a mythology thing, but it's where this guy used this method to enable the king to make these major gains. And the short version is you want to start here, start at the end. So you fill this block in first. Now this is counter to what normally happens. Normally people say, okay, what's the first step? What are we going to do? Well, if you focus on the first step, the strong tendency is to do what you've always done. You just fall into doing it the way you did it the last time. And there's no checks and balances to see, did the last time work? And you don't want to just do it the way you started before, because you are likely not going to end up where you want to end up. If you start the way you did it before, you're probably going to end up where you were and where you didn't want to be. So you start at the end, and then you fill this block in second, right? And then you come in and you do this one third. And that gives you a new starting point, a real starting point. And it's going to help you with your KPIs. It's going to help you with gating, go, no-go decisions. You can lay that out, and this is going to give you a much better picture of design than it would have if you started from here, because if you start from here, we tend to think incrementally. I'm going to leave it there. The next thing, if we were working together, the next thing I would do is then go back to this one and say, all right, now what does 10x look like? Let's say that you had a magic wand and you could get to 10x. What does 10x look like? Because I want to get people to the point that when you are doing this kind of work, when you're doing work to get out of the comfort zone and break through, this takes a lot of energy, a lot of leadership, but we're still, you got 24 hours in a day, you're working 10-hour days. There's not an exponential increase in the amount of days worked. It's just the way you think, the transformation that people have to make. And what's interesting is incremental is not a big enough gain. It's not a big enough gain to justify the work that's needed to break out. When you can do 10x, it is enough. So it's aligned with the effort. And this is going to take 10x thinking to get out of here. And remember what I was saying, in that your sports teams, they have an opponent. Every game, there's an opponent trying to stop their every play. In business, we can use the team metaphor. We can have the coaching. We can have the best practices. We can have the KPIs. But we don't have an opponent. We may have competition, but we don't have an opponent in our face for the whole game trying to stop our plays. So we have sort of a green field to run forward with. And that's why 10x can become possible. And it forces you to start putting in the best practices. It forces you to measure. It forces you to have the development plan. So that's bringing it full circle. But I would say start with this kind of a project plan. If you don't have one, start with this one. It does work. I've used it for many, many years. Big projects, little projects. I've had project leaders underneath me who had major projects use this. And you just had this thing cascade down. It really does work. I encourage you to use it. And you can start right off the bat with creating your guiding principles. And then I would start building out your project, your leadership development. Start with a 6-month leadership development plan. Every leader should have this, this, and this. And you can do that with your leadership team. So you're all in on it together and nobody's feeling like you're doing something to them. You're doing something for them. Right. That's it. Use the link if you want to set up some time with me. It's a quick 45-minute fit call. We'll just have a conversation, see what you're working on. We can maybe leave it there. Or if you want to do some work and actually work on one of these project environments and there's a good fit and alignment, we'll take up to 2 hours to do this. And then you'll have a nice project plan that's designed for you. All right. We'll see you next time.